Well, a huge thank you, Belinda, and to all the team for putting on this such needed conference and for giving me an opportunity to talk about a subject that I am very passionate about, outdoor adventure as a rite of passage. Before I kind of get going, I also just want to acknowledge you, because when I was kind of considering, well, what do I bring to this specific group of people? And actually, I know inherently that probably the huge majority of us who've got into working in the outdoors, we do it because we see the potential of transformation. We know that that's there. And so for you, my intention for this talk is that I hope that it will reignite that hopefully it will be inspiring. And for anyone who is not familiar with the terms rites of passage, that this kind of adds a different lens to look at what you do and how we can be of best support for people, young people today. So I'd like to start first with a story. I've been very, very lucky in my life to have many adventures, both as an expedition leader and on my own. And these have been massive for me. I've learned about myself, I've learned about the world. I've had an opportunity to walk thousands of miles in wilderness. I've faced bears, elks, snakes. I've crossed glaciers with minimal equipment. I've ice climbed in snowstorms. I've even, and I know this sounds awful, it turned out positive, been kidnapped in northern Pakistan in the Karakoram. And as a midwife, I've had the honor of working with many indigenous communities around the world. I remember delivering a baby using my Petzl head torch whilst a desert storm kind of raged around me and cut off all electricity. And these experiences were amazing, but nothing compared to what happened to me, the personal sense of transformation and change that I went through when I took an intentional rite of passage. As part of a rite of passage experience, I spent 4 days and 4 nights alone in the desert, without food and without shelter. And probably about day 2 or day 3 into that, having not eaten, having faced all the elements, and walked for like hours and sat for hours and reflected, thrown things off the side of the cliffs, cried. I came to feel parts of myself that I had long hidden, parts that brought up a lot of grief for me. You know, in particular for me, it was about my childhood or aspects of my childhood, and this grief was enormous. And I had to face it. There was nothing else I could do. I had to move with it. I had to talk to it. And at the same time, I discovered this part of me, this new part, this surge of like, actually, I want to change these stories. I don't want to be kind of entangled with parts of me that stopped me being able to move forward into my life. And I really felt this sense, this commitment of wanting to parent myself. And as part of this experience, I was supported by about 20 people, 2 guides, and they supported me both before I went out in terms of getting really clear what was my intention, what did I want to mark, and they supported me when I returned. They welcomed me, and they gave me an opportunity to share my story of what happened to me whilst I was out there. And this was an incredible experience. I had to be vulnerable. I had to show parts of myself that don't get the kind of public view, the vulnerability, the intimacy of, you know, what that experience was like for me, the awe, the challenge, the grit, the way nature had revealed itself to me. And I can honestly say when I came back, well, first I should say they offered me a mirroring, which is a practice of reflecting back to me what they heard. And that gave me such a deeper sense of like understanding what on earth happened there for me and what that meant for me, and also a deeper sense of my gifts. So I can honestly say when I came back from that experience, I felt changed on a very cellular level. It was like for the first time in my life, I'd actually met myself. I felt like I'd been able to mark something. I was no longer that child that was kind of like entangled a bit in old story and not really giving myself the chance to like grow. And I think in terms, I've always loved nature, but the level of kind of palpable sense of support that I got during that experience was like never before, and that has never left me. And I think for me, this marking of me wanting to parent myself was very real, because when I got back, I changed everything. I left where I lived, I left a long-term relationship, and I committed to making my work in life, what I love and what I'd come to understand were my gifts. And I tell you this story because I kind of want to unpick, well, what was the difference between all those incredible adventures, and there were many, compared to that rite of passage? And is there anything within that we can learn, the ingredients of that we can learn in terms of the kind of support that we want to bring people in the outdoors today? So you may have heard of a term, rite of passage. Just to be clear, this is the definition that I'm using. A rite of passage is an intentional, meaningful marker of transition from one stage of life to another. Arnold van Gennep, who in the early 1900s, who's an anthropologist who spent years researching peoples, communities, indigenous communities around the world, he discovered that at pivotal times of change that we all experience or part experience, such as birth, child to adult, marriage, death, there were specific meaningful markers or ceremonies around that person in order to help them step more consciously and confidently into the next part of their life. And just to be clear, I'm going to focus on the child to adult, or how I understand it, particularly in modern context, child to greater maturity, mainly because that is my experience and the kind of point of this course, of this talk. I'm just going to take a glass of water. So we have had rites of passage for, as Belinda said, for young people for thousands of years. And that was to support them to become much more attuned to who they were and what their purpose was, and to build resilience. And these often were taken, young people were taken from the community in which they were part of. They were sent off on a challenge that was often in wilderness, and then they would return back to that community, who would support them, who would mirror them, who would help them bring back their experience back into their everyday life. And whilst he found that there were, of course, differences in terms of the practices that people use, the ceremonies, the meaningful kind of practices around that, he did find that there was a common arc, a sort of journey that each person would go through as part of rite of passage. And he described 3 phases. And I'm going to talk more about them in order to kind of unpick, well, what's the relevance to us? So it starts with preparation, also known as separation. And then we move into the threshold, the liminal time. And then we come into the return, incorporation. So preparation, what do I mean by preparation? Often when we find ourselves facing change, whether we're conscious to it or not, it can be really powerful to consider the path that we have walked to get here. Who were we and who are we right now? In order to create the space to move forward, we need to consider what we're going to let go of, what no longer serves us. Life changes us, whether we like it or not. And some of the aspects of who we were kind of become stagnant, and they don't serve us anymore. And in fact, if we don't shift them, if we don't let go, then they can entangle us and stop us moving forward. So the preparation phase was not just physical, because of course that would be there. You would have been supporting your young people to have the skills to survive out in these challenges, but it would definitely be an internal exploration. And what I find interesting when we think about young people today, as we just said, it is a challenging time. And, you know, in a way, we see young people, they're pushing against the boundaries. We see troubles with parents and schools and systems. And maybe this is something that they know innately, that they do need to change. Something is shifting in them. And Michael Meade, who's an amazing speaker about rites of passage, amongst other things, has kind of popularized this African proverb, which I do believe is still very relevant today. If the fires that innately burn inside youths are not intentionally and lovingly added to the hearth of community, they will burn down the structures of culture just to feel the warmth. And what that is speaking to is the fact that young people innately know they have a calling. It comes of like, they need to shift away from what was. They need to burn down what they've been given in order to know what they have and who they are. But if we don't meet them, if we don't find ways, meaningful ways of marking this, whether they're conscious to it or not, this change within them, they will do it anyway. But unfortunately, as we see, they do it, they initiate themselves into maturity, but either through unhealthy or even risky behavior. We know about drugs, misuse, alcohol, stuff that's going on online, bullying, gangs. These are just some of what young people are having to go through in order to kind of discover who they are. So the preparation was about meeting this part of young people and using it, meeting them consciously in that. And it was also described as separation because young people get to a point where they need to leave the family. They need to leave in order to discover who they are. And then that moves us into threshold. So we live in a very fast pace. I'm sure I'm in this too. We scroll through Instagram fast, the movies that we watch, what we even expect of ourselves. We're so fast paced. So the idea of a threshold in some ways is quite unfamiliar to us, but an essential part of how we can make the most of change, or what the potential of change is. Because the threshold is the place between. We're no longer the person we were, but we're not yet the person we're going to become. And so the middle, this becoming, is an essential time of listening. It's not a time to fill young people with all the list of things they need to do in order to be a better person or to get on that course or get into university. It's the time where they need to be emptied, where they need to go quiet, where they need to listen. So the threshold was about leaving the familiar, not just the family now, it's about leaving the village, leaving everything they've known, including their routines, in order to get closer to who they are. So as part of a threshold, a young person would be pushed into a challenge. Pushed is a questionable word, but taken to a challenge. And this was about creating the stretch environment where they have to discover their resilience. And I'm sure we're all very familiar with this model, the comfort, stretch, panic. If we stay in the comfort zone, we stay small. If we go just into the panic, the survival, we're just in survival, fight or flight. It's the stretch zone where we do the greatest learning. But by inherently, it means that we have to leave the comfort. We have to move into stretch, into uncomfortableness, into the unknown, into the unfamiliar. Because these experiences are what provide us an opportunity to develop both emotional and physical resilience. So a lot of these threshold experiences were in nature and in wilderness, and that was for very good reason. When we're outdoors in nature, we don't have the gadgets, we don't have the distractions. We have to be in the now and we have to feel the feelings. The elements provide the opportunity to experience what you're capable of and build emotional resilience, which will see them throughout all of their life. It's the building of that muscle to cope with the changes that will inevitably come. But also when we spend extended periods of time in nature alone, we get an opportunity to develop a different platform, a different relationship with nature that isn't just transactional, that is actually much more about emotional connection. Because young people get to see that there is an aliveness to nature, that there's micro patterns, there's stories, that it can even be a mirror to our inner life. You know, an example of that is that nothing in nature is linear. Everything is cyclical. And for a young person facing change, so much change, and having that constantly mirrored to them, that actually, hang on, change is necessary. Because each cycle, whether it's the season, whether it's a life growth cycle, it feeds the next. But also as we spend more time in nature, we get to see that nothing works alone. Everything is interconnected. And for a young person stepping into maturity to see that is like a natural push from the me philosophy, which is often the kind of child philosophy, into the we. And what I've seen in rites of passage work is this isn't just about the human we. This is about nature and the whole. So, and the other thing about that is that I've seen, which has been one of the most powerful things I've seen about this work, is that it seems to lean very naturally into gratitude, embodied gratitude, and their place in it. So the threshold is where a young person would have to be out there on their own having this challenge, but they would be held by people that they love and care about, and I've no doubt that would have kind of added to the edge. So then there was the return. I'm sure many of us who've experienced going and having lots of adventures would have had that experience where you come home and there's a bit of wall of silence. And our loved ones, with all the best meaning in the world, will ask us the questions, but the experience tends to sort of stay in the highlights of ooh, this happened to me. So what happens to the depth of the story? What happens to the grit, to the challenge, to the stuff that really moved me? It becomes silenced, and arguably kind of remains on the mountain. So the return is the most critical part of a rite of passage. It's also kind of called incorporation, which is a bit of a big word, but what that means is in body. So it's about bringing your experience in that adventure, in that rite of passage, in that threshold, and integrating it into your body and into your life so that you get to take home this experience. And they did that in a few different ways. We do that in a few different ways. Number one is story. And giving an opportunity for a young person to share their experience after a threshold is a very powerful thing to witness. And when they get mirrored, it's not like an analysis, which I have to say for young people is probably maybe the first time in their life where they just get to share their story and have their own wisdom mirrored back to them. And it's about finding the medicine in the story. Now the language sounds a bit like out of context. What do I mean by medicine? Because it's more than a positive attribute. Within the story is often, for young people, a kind of emblem or something that they're going to take with them for the rest of their life, which is going to nurture them and support them. And then there's this other piece about being witnessed. So, being witnessed has many benefits. I think number one, to say that rites of passage traditionally was not a personal development practice. It was for the health of the community, because young people returning who had a clearer sense of who they were and what their gifts were in the world would obviously help that community. But it was also believed that within the story, there was medicine for the community itself. So people would turn up. They would listen to young people. And as we described earlier, that doesn't happen. Can you imagine the kind of respect and reverence that would have been around young people returning, having that sense that the support of the community they were part of? But also having people there was about, as a young, it's about accountability. As they discover more about their gifts and their intentions for themselves and the world, they've got people there who are going to hold and support them when they return, and they have to face the kind of challenges of the return. And which I always think is quite poignant about rites of passage, in our culture, is that as young people return, they were treated differently. They had a different role, and so the community had to respond differently to them. They had a different role within it. But as young people stepped up, it also meant that adults and elders had to move away, had to make space for young people to actually grow, which I don't think is something that happens so much. So why am I saying this now? We are facing a massive escalation of mental health concerns, a crisis for young people in this country, as has been said already. We've got the highest number of people struggling with mental health concerns, and the highest number of young people being referred to child or youth mental health services. We know that secondary schools are really challenged by the amount of young people with mental health concerns, and also just not knowing how to meet them. We also know, sadly, that if children struggle with poor mental health, they're more likely to have that in adulthood. And when you put that in the context of our culture, which is higher rates of screen time and lower rates of outdoor time, both having negative impact on mental health, and arguably, we're kind of living in a bit of a comfort crisis, where there's a real resistance, both from parents, both from schools, both from systems, that kind of don't want to let young people go into the uncomfortableness, into that sort of stretch zone, having, who knows, or very likely, negative impacts on their ability to develop their resilience to help them for the whole of their life. So the other thing, when we put that into a global context, which also has been noted, we are facing climate change, and climate anxiety is becoming an increasing thing that I'm seeing in my work. And as educators, as people who work in the outdoors, I do want to bring the question, is it our responsibility to be part of this movement, to kind of maybe move away from a transactional relationship with nature, but more into an emotional one, where we know that that's more likely to impact on young people taking care and taking responsibility for nature in the future? But with that all aside, we're talking about teenagers here, and we've all been them. We know how challenging that time is. There's so much change, social, emotional, physical. And in my experience of working with young people in this work is that when I ask them to reflect on specific questions at the right time and the right environment, such as, who am I? What are my values? What do I want for myself? What story am I ready to let go of? What do I want for the world? They are so thirsty for it. It's as if they've never been asked it before. or at least not in relationship just to their path, their life path. They're hungry. And so rites of passage have been here for this very reason, to meet them. And it's like, and actually, yeah, interestingly, in terms of its, talking about research, in America, there is a collaboration between University of San Francisco and University of Domingo, and also Youth Passageways, which is a rites of passage organisation there, looking at the research. And what they're finding, the kind of the most recent stuff that's coming out is saying that those who've experienced a rite of passage, a university kind of cohort, those who had experienced them versus those who hadn't, the ones that had were more than 2 times likely to explain or report their mental health as being good or excellent. So we have had these rites of passage experiences for a long time. And I suppose the question I want to kind of pose or invite in us to be with over these few days and hopefully thereafter is, are we doing enough? Is what we're doing meeting the needs of young people today with all the things that they're having to face? And are there things that we can learn from rites of passage to guide us and inform us in what we do? And I believe so, because I think adventure is the perfect vehicle to bring rites of passage, because inherently we already have so many of the bare bones. We do take people out into the outdoors. We do take people into stretch. We do offer opportunity for them to learn new skills, new insights about who they are. So I'm just going to offer a kind of few ways that I think we can do this. Preparation. We do prepare young people well on many levels. We know when they go out on the hill, they know how to pack a bag, how to go on a trangia, how to risk assess a river crossing. But when we bring the rites of passage lens to preparation, it's about looking at that young person and bringing the whole of their story into it. What are they experiencing right now? What challenges, what changes? And giving the opportunity of the adventure to use this to meet that. Because for some, it may be the only opportunity they have to meet that part of them. So asking them, where are you at? What are you meeting in your life? What wants to change? What are you willing to let go of in order to create the future you want? How do you want to make this meaningful for you? The threshold, interesting also, I think we do very well, or we could do very well. And I'd ask us to think as leaders and organisations, are we taking young people to the appropriate stretch? And I'm not suggesting we send all young people out to do a 4-day and night fast in the desert, wouldn't be appropriate, but nor would not giving them the opportunity to find that stretch. And my experience of doing this, I've used a variety of different practices, including a 48-hour solo or a 24-hour solo where they have to fast and keep a fire going through the night. I've taken groups out into the mountains in the darkness, and we've done a dawn till dusk solo walk, fasted. With younger groups, I mean, literally to the age of sort of 11, 12, I've done where I've taken them out into the woods and we've watched the sunset. They've done it on their own, where they have to experience going from dusk to darkness and the impact that that's happening in their own being. What does that mean for them? And then the return. One of the reasons I was super excited about talking to you is because I believe all of you guys will have relationship to the community of young people. We don't live in Indigenous communities anymore, but we do have the possibility of relating to young people's community. We work with schools. Schools are young people's community. We work with youth groups. We work with parents who have, family and grandparents. So the question is, how do we bring the young person's life into what we're doing to make it more relevant for them, to support them to make the story move from the mountainside into their home and beyond? And finally, that piece around the story and the mirroring, it's a bigger thing, and I'm really happy to talk about people afterwards, but I've sat in a group of like 20 plus teenagers, and when I witness them hear their story, it is literally one of the most profound things I've ever seen. It's like, for the first time in their life, they get to hear themselves, they get to hear their own wisdom, and it's like a million light bulbs going off. So I stand here as someone who has had an experience of working in the exhibition world for many years, plus now bringing rites of passage for many years. And I've seen the power of this work. And I totally believe in the power of the outdoors in moving people through transformational change. And so I kind of want to hone our practices. And I don't believe that it needs to be that complicated. And so I'm going to offer just a few things for people to sort of take away with. Number one, facilitation. We can all learn that. We can all learn what prompts, what invitations to offer to young people at certain times in order to help weave the meaning, the thread of that, I call it like the golden thread of meaning, so that the physical journey mirrors the developmental journey and is infused with their own meaning. Secondly, rites of passage is not a therapy, but it's definitely therapeutic. And so vulnerability and grief will come up. We need to be able to hold that, not only to keep them safe, but also to kind of encourage that, because those things, that ingredients is essential to change. And finally, if anyone who's worked with teenagers will know they can smell out inauthenticity, which means that if you're going to bring this work, you need to do this work. You need to have experienced it so you know what they're going through, but also you're a role model. You're a mentor to them. So at some point in the next, couple of days, I invite you to think for yourself, at a time in your life when you were wanting to face change, you were feeling that bubbling of needing to develop yourself, but kind of feeling entangled in an old identity. Were you supported? Did you have a rite of passage? And if you didn't, would it have made a difference? So I'm just going to finish with a short story of one of the aspects that I've changed. As part of a rite of passage experience that I do with young people, I invite their family or whoever they choose to be part of the closing circle. So the young people have gone off. They've had this extraordinary experience on their own outdoors. They've been prepared for it. They come back and then they're standing there, usually in front of about 50 people. And they have to stand in front of their adult and speak from that place, the place that's still very palpable of their experience, shiny eyes. And the level of depth, authenticity, and the sense of kind of clarity that comes through is phenomenal. And then the parent is invited to speak, or adult, whoever it is, right back at the young person. And that person is not the person they dropped off. It wasn't the person they had those issues with 2 weeks ago. This is the person they're seeing right now in that experience. And in that moment, I've seen it's like a new bond or commitment is formed, no matter what challenges they go through, and they will go through when they get back, but that can't be taken away. And what I've come to understand is that, of course, it's about the ripples. This community of people, they're going to be there with these young people way after I've been there. And so it's essential to bring them there. And actually, part of my gratitude as well to speak in front of you all is that I recognise that by bringing the kind of awareness of rites of passage to young people and essential, is like we're growing a community of awareness around that and around how we can look at young people with that kind of reverence and how we can make these kind of stories possible for more and more young people. So, thank you very much. Thank you for a wonderful time. Thank you. Yeah, sure. If anyone has any questions, I think we're all right on time, but I'm really happy to answer, and also afterwards as well. Sorry. Yes.
Hi there. Very interesting talk that. Just one observation. It's more of an observation than a question. There's a lot of stuff out there about young people, but in my mind, I've touched 50 now. We're forgetting about older people as well. And in the area I live, for example, I work in employability as well as what I do outdoors. There's many older people that have mental health issues, employment issues, housing issues, other things that are going in their lives. And to me, that's as equally as important. 1 in 6, it was mentioned, 1 in 6 young people, 1 in 4 older people suffer from mental health. And to me, that's as crucial because they're equally as important in society as a young person, in my eyes.
I absolutely 100 times agree. And I would say that actually traditionally with rites of passage, it was there for the health of the whole community. And what's been interesting in the research is that it's shown that it was just as supportive to elders and olders within a community because it gave them a different perspective, role, reverence around that. It was a whole system approach. So yes, absolutely. And there is some really interesting work happening for adults in rites of passage as well. Thank you. Oh.
I just have a very short question. As we're mentioning rites of passage during adulthood, I was wondering what age were you when you went through your rite of passage?
Very good question. I've been through some. It's not just one. I think there's an important to say that, particularly in our culture. It's not like we have this one experience. I think it's a kind of development of deeper maturity. I was lucky. I grew up in many different communities around the world, so I kind of experienced from that perspective a rite of passage when I was younger. But then in my 20s, I went out and did the rite of passage that I'm talking about, yeah.
Yeah, really interesting talk. Thank you, Israh. I just wondered, could you just re-explain for me what mirroring means? Because I didn't really understand that, and I don't come from a background of therapy or
Yeah, absolutely. So mirroring is a really interesting technique, and it's definitely one that needs learning and growing. It's where I'm sort of sharing my story about what's happened, and in the mirroring is reflecting back what they've heard, but particular with an intent of supporting that young person to hear their own medicine within the story. So it might be, for instance, that this young person has had a really challenging time, and then something came in at the right moment, and it's just maybe there's a kind of a repetition within the story that you can hear that they can't necessarily hear themselves. So it's offering that back. One thing I also just really want to say, I spoke a lot about the language of meaningfulness, and I just want to be really clear about that. If you bring rites of passage to your work, it will make it more meaningful in the sense that it's weaving the story of this person's life into the work and beyond. But what I want to make clear is that rite of passage isn't a religion, and it isn't belonging to one belief system or theological belief system. In fact, and it's not about validating young people against someone else's belief system. Rites of passage is actually about validating against your own, and part of the experience is discovering what is your own. So rites of passage is made up of an individual's own beliefs and values, which as leaders is really important, because that means that we can encourage young people to discover, how do you make meaning? Sorry, it's needed, came through. Yeah. Okay, cool.
I've got a girl guiding hat on, and we have thousands of leaders, just regular people working with young children and young people all the time. I'm just wondering if there are any kind of support ideas for educating our leaders to have those sort of conversations when they are not professionals in the space. And if anybody in the room can kind of give us any guidance as well, that'd be really great. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I mean, absolutely. There is more and more people out there who are offering kind of practices and deeper immersions for instance, organisations like yourselves who want to kind of bring a bit more meaning into the work. And that part of what I have done with groups and organisations is I've taken those leaders out, and we've had those experiences. And then we've kind of shared both in terms of what it's like to hold those spaces, but also bringing in their experience, because ultimately, as I'm sure all of us know, that is the best way to learn, is like to actually go through it yourself. Okay. I think that was one more, wasn't it? I mean, I'm happy to talk to anyone at any time. I'm here for the next 2 days.
Hi, thank you. So rite of passage is all about change and acknowledging change. And one of the problems I've found in my work is that young people are not heard. And every single day of our lives, we go to bed a different person to the person we woke up as. And rite of passage is kind of a big event. But how do we get parents especially to start listening to their kids who are different people every single day and actually accepting the little changes that happen rather than the big rite of passage? I mean, I've had so many situations where parents have treated, their kid as the same kid that was there 5 years ago, her favourite colour is pink. Well, no, her favourite colour hasn't been pink for a long, long time. And I think so how do we get the smaller changes accepted on a regular daily basis?
Well, it's a really good question, and I think actually you could answer it in two different ways. I'll start with the one that's kind of really strong for me, is that, rite of passage, as I said before, it wasn't just for the child, it would have to be for the parent too. And so only by these experiences would you be able to shift from seeing that person how they used to be as a child into something else. So that they were also an essential part. Although you're talking about them being big, they don't necessarily have to be, but there is a need to cut the cord or the way of things were in order to kind of get something different. And then you kind of make this new commitment of how to talk with each other. This is quite a lot to ask someone to suddenly be going from like, we talk to each other like this, to suddenly we're like creating space for each other. I do think that's possible, but I think these processes are there for a reason. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Israh. What a beautiful, it's not a word you would normally use, but it's a beautiful start to the conference. Such amazing wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.